What if I told you that the first president of the United States never went to college? That one president couldn't read until he was 18? That another spoke 7 languages fluently and could write in Latin with one hand and Greek with the other simultaneously? And that one guy just read some law books in a cabin and decided he was qualified to run a country? American presidents have come from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and West Point. They've also come from nowhere, self-taught, self-made, armed with nothing but borrowed books and relentless ambition. Some were geniuses, some were barely literate, some had PhDs, some had nothing but grit. Tonight, we're going to explore the education of every single US president, from George Washington to Joe Biden. We'll find out who was actually the smartest, who faked it the best, and who just got really, really lucky. So if you enjoyed this deep dive into presidential educations, consider subscribing. There's plenty more strange history where this came from. Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you want, and let's start with a man who had no formal education whatsoever, but somehow became the template for everyone who followed. George Washington, the self-taught surveyor who started it all. George Washington never went to college. Let that sink in for a moment. The guy on the dollar bill, the father of the country, the man who could not tell a lie, allegedly, never sat in a university lecture hall. Not once. He didn't even finish what we'd call high school. His formal education ended around age 11 when his father died, and that was that. But here's the thing. Washington wasn't uneducated. He was self-taught in the way people used to be when self-taught actually meant something exhausting. He became a surveyor through apprenticeships, learning to measure land by actually walking it, mapping Virginia's wilderness with a compass and a lot of optimism. By the time he was a teenager, he was already working for the wealthy Fairfax family, calculating property lines in the kind of terrain that would make a modern hiker weep. And he read voraciously. He consumed the works of John Locke and Montesquieu, the Enlightenment philosophers who basically wrote the cheat codes for democracy. He studied military strategy, agriculture, philosophy, and etiquette. There's a reason his correspondence sounds like it was written by someone who attended Oxford. It's because he taught himself to write that way. Washington's education was entirely practical. He learned what he needed when he needed it, and he did it without anyone handing him a syllabus, which is either deeply inspiring or mildly horrifying, depending on how you feel about student loans. Either way, he set a precedent. You didn't need a diploma to lead a country. You just needed to read the right books and know how to cross a frozen river in the middle of the night without dying. And speaking of formal education, our second president took a very different route. John Adams, the Harvard man who argued his way to the top. John Adams went to Harvard. Of course he did. He graduated in 1755 with a Bachelor of Arts and came back 3 years later for a Master of Arts, because apparently one degree wasn't enough to prove you were smarter than everyone else in Massachusetts. And in case you were wondering, yes, he absolutely was the type of person who would remind you he went to Harvard. Frequently. After Harvard, Adams studied law under James Otis, a fiery attorney who once argued against British tax policies so passionately that he may have literally inspired the phrase, taxation without representation. Otis was brilliant, erratic, and eventually went insane after being struck in the head during a bar fight. So Adams learned law from a genius who would later wander the streets of Boston talking to invisible people, which explains a lot about Adams' personality, honestly. Adams was a devoted reader, an obsessive writer, and a man who loved an argument the way most people love dessert. He defended British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, which was about as popular as you'd expect, but he did it because he believed in the rule of law. He won. Because he was that good. His education wasn't just academic, it was combative. He learned to think by arguing, to write by writing constantly, and to lead by refusing to shut up even when everyone wished he would. He kept a diary for most of his life, filling it with observations, complaints, and the kind of self reflection that would make a modern therapist very wealthy. Adams believed education was everything. He once wrote that he studied war so his sons could study mathematics, so their sons could study poetry, which is a beautiful sentiment unless you were his son, in which case the pressure was astronomical. But we'll get to John Quincy later. For now, let's move to a man who somehow knew even more than Adams, but was far less annoying about it. Thomas Jefferson, the polymath who invented furniture. Thomas Jefferson attended the College of William and Mary in Virginia, but here's the twist: he never graduated. He studied law under George Wythe, one of the most respected legal minds in the colonies, but he didn't bother with a formal degree. He just learned everything and left, which is the most Thomas Jefferson thing imaginable. Jefferson was fluent in at least 6 languages: English, French, Italian, Latin, Greek, and Spanish. He read extensively in all of them, building a personal library so massive that it eventually became the foundation of the Library of Congress after the British burned the original one. His book collection was so large that when he sold it to the government, they had to invent new cataloging systems just to organize it. 17,000 volumes. He was basically a human Wikipedia, but with better handwriting. He was a scientist, an architect, a musician, a botanist, and an inventor. He designed Monticello, his Virginia estate, incorporating innovations like dumbwaiters, alcove beds, and skylights. He invented the swivel chair, presumably because sitting still while thinking was unbearable. He also designed a device called a polygraph, which wasn't a lie detector, but a machine that created duplicate copies of letters as he wrote them. He was into efficiency the way people today are, into productivity apps. Jefferson studied philosophy, mathematics, science, and law, often teaching himself from books when formal instruction wasn't available. He believed education was the foundation of democracy, and he founded the University of Virginia late in life to prove it. He designed the campus, selected the curriculum, and even chose the books for the library. Control freak doesn't quite cover it. But for all his brilliance, Jefferson was also deeply contradictory. He wrote that all men are created equal while enslaving over 600 people throughout his lifetime. Education didn't make him moral. It just made him articulate. Still, if we're measuring raw intellectual horsepower, Jefferson is near the top of the list, which brings us to someone who might have been even smarter, but was far less interested in showing off. James Madison, the tiny constitutional genius. James Madison went to Princeton, back when it was called the College of New Jersey, and graduated in 1771. But he didn't just graduate. He completed a 4-year program in 2 years, because apparently sleep was optional if you were sufficiently caffeinated and determined. After finishing, he stayed an extra year to study Hebrew, ethics, and theology under the university president, John Witherspoon, a Scottish minister who signed the Declaration of Independence and believed education was a moral obligation. Madison was small, 5'4", around 100 pounds. He looked like a strong breeze could knock him over, and he frequently complained of mysterious illnesses that modern doctors suspect were anxiety-related. But intellectually, he was a giant. He studied history, political philosophy, and law obsessively, filling notebooks with observations about ancient governments, the failures of confederacies, and the mechanics of power. When the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in 1787, Madison showed up with a plan, not just ideas, a written plan. The Virginia Plan, which became the skeleton of the U.S. Constitution. He took notes during every session, documenting the debates so thoroughly that we know more about what happened in that room than almost any other political event in early American history. His notes weren't published until after his death, which is probably for the best, because they reveal just how much sausage making went into the whole more perfect union thing. Madison believed in federal power, checks and balances, and the idea that human nature required institutional restraint. He didn't trust people to govern themselves without structure, which seems cynical until you scroll through social media for 5 minutes. He co-wrote the Federalist Papers with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, churning out essays defending the Constitution with the kind of intellectual rigor that would make a modern political op-ed look like a grocery list. His education wasn't just about memorizing facts. It was about thinking systematically, understanding history, and designing institutions that could outlast any individual. He built a government with a degree from Princeton and a lot of sleepless nights. And speaking of people who studied way too hard, let's talk about the next guy, who also went to William and Mary but had a much more exciting college experience. James Monroe. The revolutionary dropout, James Monroe attended the College of William and Mary. Just like Thomas Jefferson, and just like Jefferson, he didn't graduate. But Monroe had a better excuse. He dropped out to fight in the Revolutionary War, which is arguably the most valid reason to leave college early. Sorry, professor, can't make it to Latin class. I'm crossing the Delaware with George Washington. Monroe fought at the Battle of Trenton in 1776, where he was shot in the shoulder and nearly bled to death. A doctor on the battlefield saved his life by clamping the severed artery with his fingers. Monroe carried the musket ball in his body for the rest of his life, which is the kind of detail that makes modern medical procedures seem almost boring. After the war, Monroe studied law under Thomas Jefferson, because if you were a young Virginian interested in politics, that's just what you did. Jefferson became his mentor, lending him books, offering advice, and generally shaping Monroe's worldview. Monroe absorbed Jefferson's democratic ideals, his suspicion of centralized power, and his love of France, which would become awkward later when France started guillotining people. Monroe's education was split between formal study and practical experience. He learned law from books and from Jefferson. He learned diplomacy by serving as a minister to France, Britain, and Spain. He learned leadership by being governor of Virginia and later Secretary of State and Secretary of War simultaneously during the War of 1812, because apparently one cabinet position wasn't stressful enough. He wasn't the most intellectually dazzling president. He didn't speak 7 languages or design buildings, but he was competent, steady, and experienced. His presidency is remembered for the Monroe Doctrine, a policy that told Europe to stay out of the Americas or else. It was bold, assertive, and surprisingly effective. Not bad for a guy who never finished college, but if you want to talk about overachievers, the next president makes everyone else look like they were phoning it in. John Quincy Adams, the overachieving son who spoke 7 languages. John Quincy Adams went to Harvard, graduating in 1787 with a Bachelor of Arts and returning for a Master of Arts in 1790. But that's almost irrelevant because by the time he got to Harvard, he'd already received an education most people couldn't achieve in a lifetime. Adams traveled to Europe as a teenager, serving as secretary to his father during diplomatic missions in France, the Netherlands, and Russia. He attended school in Paris and Amsterdam, learned French fluently, and later studied at Leiden University in the Netherlands, one of the oldest and most prestigious universities in Europe. By age 14, he was serving as translator for the American envoy to Russia. 14. Most teenagers today can't translate a text message into proper English. He was fluent in 7 languages: English, French, Dutch, German, Latin, Greek, and Russian. He read classical literature in the original languages, kept detailed diaries his entire life, and wrote poetry. Not good poetry necessarily, but poetry. He translated German literature and studied astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. He was the kind of person who made everyone else feel inadequate just by existing. At Harvard, he studied law, rhetoric, and the classics. After graduating, he apprenticed under Theophilus Parsons, a prominent attorney, and was admitted to the bar in 1790. But Adams wasn't content with just being a lawyer. He wanted to serve. He became a diplomat, a senator, secretary of state, and eventually president. His education wasn't just about accumulating knowledge, it was about duty. His father had drilled into him the idea that he was born to serve the Republic, and Adams took it seriously, maybe too seriously. He was brilliant, principled, and deeply unhappy. He once wrote that his life had been a series of disappointments, which seems ungrateful when you've been to Leiden and speak 7 languages, but misery doesn't care about your resume. Still, if we're ranking presidents by sheer intellectual achievement, John Quincy Adams is near the top. But not everyone needed 7 languages to run the country. Some just needed grit. Andrew Jackson, the self-taught brawler who read law books. Andrew Jackson had no formal education. None. He grew up poor in the Carolina backcountry, orphaned by age 14, and spent his teenage years doing whatever it took to survive. He didn't go to college. He didn't attend an academy. He was taught to read and write by a Presbyterian tutor, and that was about it. But Jackson wasn't illiterate. He was self-taught in the most brutal sense of the term. He decided he wanted to be a lawyer, so he read law books. Just read them. He apprenticed under a lawyer in North Carolina, absorbing legal principles through observation and sheer determination. In 1787, he was admitted to the bar in North Carolina. A year later, he moved to Tennessee and started practicing law on the frontier, where legal disputes were often settled with fists or pistols as much as with arguments. Jackson learned by doing. He became a judge, a military general, and eventually president, all without a diploma to his name. He fought in duels, over a dozen by some counts. He took a bullet to the chest in 1806 and carried it for the rest of his life because removing it was too dangerous. He won the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, cementing his reputation as a military hero. His education was experiential. He learned politics by navigating Tennessee's rough and tumble frontier culture. He learned leadership by commanding troops. He learned strategy by making mistakes and surviving them. He was impulsive, hot-tempered, and ruthless. But he was also charismatic and effective. Jackson's presidency was controversial. He forced the removal of Native American tribes, vetoed the National Bank, and expanded presidential power in ways that alarmed his opponents. But he connected with ordinary people in a way that educated elites couldn't. He proved you didn't need a Harvard degree to lead. You just needed to win. And speaking of people who didn't go to Harvard, the next guy barely went anywhere. Martin Van Buren, the lawyer who learned by watching. Martin Van Buren didn't go to college. He attended Kinderhook Academy in upstate New York, a local school that provided a basic education, but nothing fancy. After that, he apprenticed as a lawyer, which was the standard path for someone without money or connections. He worked in a law office, read legal texts, observed court proceedings, and eventually learned enough to pass the bar. Van Buren was the first president born as an American citizen. Everyone before him had been born as British subjects. He was also the first president whose first language wasn't English. He grew up speaking Dutch at home in Kinderhook, a small town where Dutch culture and language persisted long after the English took over New York. He learned English later, and while he became fluent, he supposedly never lost his Dutch accent. His education was informal but effective. He learned law by practicing it. He became a skilled attorney, then a state senator, then a U.S. senator, then governor of New York, then secretary of state, then vice president, and finally president. He climbed the ladder methodically, building alliances, mastering political strategy, and avoiding unnecessary enemies. Van Buren wasn't flashy. He wasn't an intellectual giant. He didn't speak 7 languages or invent anything, but he was shrewd. He understood how power worked, how to negotiate, and how to survive politically. He helped build the Democratic Party, crafted the modern political machine, and served as a key advisor to Andrew Jackson. His presidency was defined by the Panic of 1837, an economic collapse that destroyed his reputation. He lost re-election and faded from prominence. But he left a legacy in political organization and strategy that influenced American politics for decades. Education, for Van Buren, wasn't about books. It was about observation, relationships, and timing. And sometimes that's enough. But not everyone skipped college and succeeded. Some went to college and still didn't finish. William Henry Harrison, the medical school dropout who became president, William Henry Harrison attended Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia, studying classics and history, but he didn't graduate. He left after 3 years, possibly due to financial difficulties after his father's death. Then he enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania to study medicine, because apparently switching careers midstream was easier in the 18th century. Harrison studied under Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the most famous physicians in America, and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Rush was a pioneer in psychiatry, a proponent of bleeding as a cure for basically everything, and a man whose medical advice would probably get you killed today. Harrison absorbed what he could, but he didn't finish his medical degree either. Instead, he joined the army. He became a military officer fighting in the Northwest Indian War, serving as governor of the Indiana Territory, and defeating Tecumseh's forces at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. That victory earned him the nickname Old Tippecanoe, which he rode all the way to the White House in 1840 with one of the most ridiculous campaign slogans in American history, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Harrison's education was fragmented. He studied the classics, dabbled in medicine, and learned leadership through military service. He wasn't a scholar, he wasn't a legal mind. He was a soldier and a politician who understood how to appeal to voters. His presidency lasted 31 days. He gave a nearly 2-hour inaugural address in freezing rain without a coat, caught pneumonia, and died. Whether the speech actually killed him is debated, but the irony is too perfect to ignore. The man who studied medicine but never finished died from something a decent doctor might have prevented. Still, he made it to the White House, and the guy who replaced him actually finished college. John Tyler, the accidental president with a real degree. John Tyler attended the College of William and Mary, the same school as Jefferson and Monroe, and unlike them, he actually graduated. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in 1807 and went on to study law, which was the default career for ambitious young Virginians who could read. Tyler was disciplined, studious, and traditional. He excelled in classical studies, learning Latin and Greek, reading ancient philosophy, and absorbing the Enlightenment ideals that shaped his generation. After graduating, he studied law under his father, who was a judge, and was admitted to the Virginia bar at age 19, which sounds impressive until you remember that John Quincy Adams was translating diplomatic correspondence at 14. Tyler became a lawyer, then a state legislator, then a U.S. congressman, then governor of Virginia, then a U.S. senator, and then vice president under William Henry Harrison. He never expected to be president. Nobody did. He was added to the ticket to balance it geographically and ideologically. Then Harrison died, and Tyler became the first vice president to assume the presidency after a death in office. His presidency was a disaster. He vetoed so many bills that his own party expelled him. His entire cabinet except one resigned in protest. He was called His Accidency and became one of the most ineffective presidents in history. But he had a degree from William and Mary, which is more than some of the others could say. Tyler's education gave him knowledge, but it didn't give him political skill. He was rigid, principled to a fault, and unable to compromise. Sometimes being well educated just means you're better at explaining why you're right and everyone else is wrong. And speaking of stubborn people with degrees, the next guy actually finished college and then got things done. James K. Polk, the workaholic who graduated with honors. James K. Polk attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and graduated in 1818 with a Bachelor of Arts. He didn't just graduate, he graduated with honors, finishing first in his class in mathematics and the classics. He was serious, disciplined, and utterly joyless. If James K. Polk ever told a joke, it wasn't recorded. After graduating, Polk studied law under Felix Grundy, a prominent attorney and politician in Tennessee. He was admitted to the bar, started to practice, and entered politics almost immediately. He became a congressman, Speaker of the House, and governor of Tennessee before running for president in 1844 as a dark horse candidate. He won partly because he promised to serve only one term. And he kept that promise, which makes him almost unique among politicians. Polk's presidency was astonishingly productive. He expanded the United States significantly, overseeing the annexation of Texas, the settlement of the Oregon boundary dispute, and the Mexican-American War, which added California and the Southwest to U.S. territory. He worked constantly, obsessively. He held regular cabinet meetings, micromanaged every department, and kept a detailed diary of every decision. He also died 3 months after leaving office, just dropped dead at age 53, probably from exhaustion. He worked himself to death, which is either admirable or insane depending on your perspective. Polk's education taught him discipline, organization, and how to achieve goals methodically. He set objectives, made plans, and executed them. He was the kind of student who color-coded his notes and never missed a deadline. As president, he did the same thing, set goals, achieved them, and then died. Not everyone was so intense. The next guy barely tried. Zachary Taylor. The general who never went to school, Zachary Taylor had no formal education. None. He grew up on the Kentucky frontier where schools were scarce and survival was the priority. His parents taught him the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic, but that was it. He never attended an academy or university. He never studied law or medicine or anything else that required a diploma. Instead, Taylor joined the Army. He became a career military officer, serving for nearly 40 years before entering politics. He fought in the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, and the Second Seminole War. He earned the nickname Old Rough and Ready for his willingness to endure the same hardships as his soldiers. Taylor's education was entirely practical. He learned leadership by commanding troops. He learned strategy by fighting battles. He learned politics by observing how military decisions intersected with government policy. He wasn't intellectual. He didn't read philosophy or speak multiple languages. He just knew how to win. He became a national hero during the Mexican-American War, winning key victories at Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and Buena Vista. His success made him a celebrity, and the Whig Party nominated him for president in 1848, despite his complete lack of political experience. His presidency lasted 16 months. He died suddenly, possibly from cholera or typhoid fever, after attending a 4th of July celebration where he consumed large quantities of cherries and iced milk. Whether the fruit killed him is unclear, but it's funnier to believe it did. Taylor proved you didn't need education to become president. You just needed to be popular and not die from cherries. The next guy, however, actually studied things, sort of. Millard Fillmore, the self-taught lawyer who founded a university. Millard Fillmore didn't go to college. He grew up poor in upstate New York, working on his father's farm and receiving only a few months of formal schooling. But Fillmore was determined. He taught himself to read using a dictionary, walked miles to borrow books, and apprenticed under a lawyer to learn the profession. He studied law by reading legal texts and observing court cases. There were no shortcuts, no structured programs. He just read, practiced, and gradually became competent enough to pass the bar. He opened a law practice in Buffalo and built a successful career through sheer persistence. Later in life, Fillmore helped found the University of Buffalo, serving as its first chancellor. A man who never attended college created one, which is either beautifully ironic or deeply hypocritical, depending on your mood. Fillmore became vice president under Zachary Taylor and assumed the presidency when Taylor died. His administration is mostly remembered for the Compromise of 1850, which delayed the Civil War by a decade, but also included the Fugitive Slave Act, one of the most morally reprehensible laws in American history. Fillmore's education, or lack thereof, shaped his worldview. He believed in self-improvement, hard work, and merit. But he also lacked the intellectual depth to grapple with the moral complexities of slavery. He enforced the law because it was the law, without questioning whether the law was just. Sometimes education isn't just about learning facts. It's about learning how to think critically. And Fillmore, for all his determination, never quite learned that. The next guy went to college and still made terrible decisions. Franklin Pierce, the Bowdoin graduate who drank too much, and Franklin Pierce attended Bowdoin College in Maine, graduating in 1824. He was a decent student, popular with his classmates, and known for his charm and good looks. He studied classics, rhetoric, and philosophy, though he wasn't particularly distinguished academically. After graduating, he attended Northampton Law School in Massachusetts, studied under prominent attorneys, and was admitted to the bar. Pierce was likable. Too likable, he made friends easily, gave great speeches, and could win people over in conversation. He became a congressman, then a senator, and seemed destined for greatness. But he struggled with alcoholism, a problem that worsened after personal tragedies. His son was killed in a train accident shortly before his inauguration, and Pierce never recovered. His presidency was marked by indecision, poor judgment, and an inability to address the growing crisis over slavery. He signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which led to violent conflict in Kansas and pushed the country closer to civil war. Pierce's education gave him knowledge and social skills, but it didn't prepare him for loss, leadership under pressure, or moral clarity. He was educated, charming, and utterly ineffective. Sometimes a college degree just means you know how to read. It doesn't mean you know what to do. The next guy also went to college and also made questionable choices. There's a pattern forming here. James Buchanan, the Dickinson graduate who did nothing. James Buchanan attended Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, graduating in 1809. He was expelled once for bad behavior. Apparently, he liked to drink and cause trouble, but was readmitted and managed to finish. After graduating, he studied law in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, under a prominent attorney and was admitted to the bar in 1812. Buchanan was intelligent, disciplined, and deeply ambitious. He built a successful legal career, entered politics, and served as a congressman, senator, minister to Russia, secretary of state, and minister to Great Britain before becoming president in 1857. He was also the only president who never married. Historians speculate about why, but Buchanan never explained. He lived with a close male friend for years, which has led to endless speculation and no definitive answers. His presidency is widely considered one of the worst in American history. He believed the federal government had no authority to prevent Southern states from seceding, so when they started leaving the Union, he did nothing. He passed the problem to Abraham Lincoln and retired. Buchanan's education was thorough. He knew law, diplomacy, and politics, but he lacked courage. He knew what was happening, understood the stakes, and chose inaction. Sometimes education teaches you how to rationalize failure, and with that, we've covered the first 15 presidents, 15 down 30 to go. We'll get there, eventually. But first, maybe close your eyes for a bit. These guys aren't going anywhere. Abraham Lincoln, the backwoods lawyer who taught himself everything. Abraham Lincoln had less than 1 year of formal schooling in his entire life. Not 1 year per grade, 1 year total. Maybe. He attended several frontier schools in Kentucky and Indiana, but they were what they called blab schools. One-room cabins where students recited lessons aloud all at once, creating a chaotic chorus of multiplication tables and spelling words. Lincoln would walk miles through the wilderness to get there, sit on a log bench, and leave when the school closed or his family moved, which was often. His stepmother, Sarah Bush Lincoln, encouraged him to read. She brought books into the household, and Lincoln devoured them. He read the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, and a biography of George Washington. He borrowed books from neighbors, walking miles to return them, sometimes copying entire passages by hand because he couldn't afford to buy his own copies. He wrote on a wooden shovel with charcoal when paper wasn't available. Lincoln decided he wanted to be a lawyer, so he taught himself law. He borrowed legal texts, Blackstone's commentaries, the revised statutes of Indiana, and read them cover to cover. He walked to courthouses to watch trials, studying how lawyers argued, how judges ruled, and how the system worked. In 1836, he passed the bar exam in Illinois without ever attending law school. He just knew the material because he'd memorized it. He wasn't naturally eloquent. His early speeches were awkward, his voice high-pitched, but he practiced. He joined a debating society, argued cases, and refined his rhetoric until he became one of the most powerful speakers in American history. The Gettysburg Address is 272 words long and is considered one of the greatest speeches ever written. Lincoln wrote it himself, probably on the back of an envelope, though that detail is disputed. Lincoln proved that formal education wasn't necessary for greatness. What mattered was curiosity, discipline, and access to books. He read everything, remembered everything, and used that knowledge to save the Union. Not bad for a guy who spent less than a year in school. But if you think Lincoln's lack of education was unusual, wait until you hear about the next guy, who couldn't even read until he was an adult. Andrew Johnson, the tailor who learned to read from his wife. Andrew Johnson never went to school, not one day. He was born into poverty in North Carolina, and by age 10, he was apprenticed to a tailor. He spent his teenage years sewing clothes, not reading books. He didn't learn to read or write until he was 18 years old, and even then, it wasn't because of any formal instruction. His wife, Eliza McCardle, taught him. Eliza was 16 when she married Johnson. She was educated, literate, and patient enough to teach her husband the alphabet. She read to him, corrected his spelling, and helped him improve his penmanship. Johnson learned arithmetic and basic grammar sitting in their small home in Greenville, Tennessee, stitching clothes by day and studying by candlelight at night. He became a tailor, then a town alderman, then mayor, then a state legislator, congressman, governor, senator, and eventually vice president under Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, Johnson became president. A man who couldn't read at 18 was suddenly leading a country torn apart by civil war. His presidency was a catastrophe. He opposed Reconstruction, clashed with Congress, and was impeached by the House of Representatives in 1868. He survived removal by one vote in the Senate, but his political career was effectively over. He returned to Tennessee, bitter and largely forgotten. Johnson's story is both inspiring and tragic. He overcame illiteracy and poverty to reach the highest office in the land, but he lacked the wisdom, empathy, and political skill to lead effectively. Education gave him the tools to rise, but it couldn't give him the judgment to succeed. Still, he proved that it's never too late to learn. even if you don't learn enough. The next president, however, had all the formal training the military could provide, and it showed. Ulysses S. Grant, the West Point graduate, who hated war. Ulysses S. Grant attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, graduating in 1843. He wasn't a standout student. He ranked 21st out of 39 in his class, which sounds mediocre until you realize that West Point was one of the most rigorous institutions in the country. He excelled in mathematics and horsemanship, but struggled with discipline and military regulations. He accumulated demerits for minor infractions and generally seemed uninterested in becoming a model soldier. Grant didn't want to go to West Point. His father arranged the appointment, and Grant went because he didn't know what else to do. He later said he hoped the academy would be abolished by Congress before he had to graduate. It wasn't, so he finished, received his commission, and became an officer in the U.S. Army. He served in the Mexican-American War, fighting under Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. He learned tactics, logistics, and leadership, but he hated the war. He later called it one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation, which is a remarkably honest assessment for a man who would later wage total war against the Confederacy. After the Mexican War, Grant struggled. He was stationed at remote outposts, separated from his family, and bored out of his mind. He drank. He resigned from the army in 1854 under a cloud of suspicion about his drinking, though the exact details remain unclear. He tried farming, real estate, and clerking in his father's leather goods store. He failed at all of it. Then the Civil War started, and suddenly Grant's military education mattered. He rejoined the army, rose through the ranks, and became the Union's most successful general. He understood logistics, persistence, and the brutal arithmetic of attrition. He won because he kept fighting when others would have quit. Grant's education at West Point gave him the technical skills to command armies, but his real education came from failure, loneliness, and learning how to endure. Sometimes the most important lessons don't come from a classroom. And speaking of people who actually enjoyed their education, the next guy went to two very prestigious schools and succeeded at both. Rutherford B. Hayes, the Kenyon and the Harvard man, who won by one vote. Rutherford B. Hayes attended Kenyon College in Ohio, graduating in 1842 as valedictorian of his class. He was serious, studious, and deeply committed to self-improvement. He excelled in classics, rhetoric, and debate, winning prizes for his oratory skills. After Kenyon, he attended Harvard Law School, earning his degree in 1845. Harvard Law was one of the premier legal institutions in the country, and Hayes thrived there, studying under prominent professors and absorbing the principles of constitutional law. After Harvard, Hayes returned to Ohio, practiced law, and entered politics. He served in the Union Army during the Civil War, rising to the rank of Major General and earning a reputation for bravery. He was wounded 5 times, once seriously. He fought at South Mountain, where he was shot in the arm, and continued to lead his men despite the injury, which is either heroic or reckless, depending on how you feel about mid-19th century military medicine. Hayes became a congressman, then governor of Ohio, and then ran for president in 1876 in one of the most controversial elections in American history. He lost the popular vote to Samuel Tilden, but won the Electoral College by 1 vote after a disputed recount and a backroom deal that effectively ended Reconstruction. The election was so contentious that some called Hayes Rutherfraud, or his fraudulency. Despite the questionable legitimacy of his victory, Hayes was a competent, honest president. He reformed the civil service, fought corruption, and tried to heal the divisions left by the Civil War. His education at Kenyon and Harvard gave him the analytical skills, legal knowledge, and rhetorical ability to navigate complex political situations. He wasn't flashy, but he was effective. Still, winning by one vote after losing the popular vote is an awkward way to start a presidency. The next guy had a much smoother path to power, though his time in office was tragically short. James A. Garfield, the self-taught scholar who spoke 9 languages, James A. Garfield attended the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in Ohio, which later became Hiram College. He worked as a janitor to pay his tuition, sweeping floors and hauling wood while studying Greek, Latin, mathematics, and philosophy. He was so good at academics that the school hired him as a teacher before he even graduated. He taught ancient languages, debated students, and preached occasionally, because Garfield was also training to be a minister. After Western Reserve, Garfield attended Williams College in Massachusetts, graduating in 1856. He excelled there, particularly in public speaking and classics. He could read and write in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. He later learned German, French, and several other languages, reportedly becoming conversant in 9 languages total. He could write Latin with one hand and Greek with the other simultaneously, which is either an impressive party trick or a sign that he had way too much free time. Garfield was a scholar, a teacher, and a preacher before he became a politician. He served in the Union Army during the Civil War, fought at Shiloh and Chickamauga, and rose to the rank of Major General. He was elected to Congress while still in uniform and served for 17 years, becoming a respected voice on finance, education, and civil rights. He was nominated for president in 1880 at a deadlocked Republican convention. He didn't seek the nomination, he was there supporting another candidate, but after 36 ballots, the delegates turned to Garfield as a compromise. He won the election and became the 20th president of the United States. He served for 6 months. On July 2nd, 1881, he was shot by Charles Guiteau, a mentally ill man who believed he deserved a government job and blamed Garfield for not giving him one. Garfield lingered for 11 weeks, his doctors poking his wounds with unsterilized instruments, almost certainly making the infection worse. He died on September 19th. Garfield's education was extraordinary. He was self-taught, intellectually curious, and accomplished in multiple fields. But none of it saved him from a bullet and bad medicine. Sometimes brilliance doesn't matter when fate decides otherwise. The man who replaced him, however, was educated, stylish, and completely unprepared for the presidency. Chester A. Arthur, the Union College graduate, who became president by accident. Chester attended Union College in New York, graduating in 1848. He studied classics, mathematics, and law, and was a member of the debating society. He wasn't the top student, but he was well-liked, charming, and fashionable. Arthur cared deeply about appearances. He owned over 80 pairs of pants and changed clothes multiple times a day. He was called Gentleman Boss because he looked like he belonged in a men's fashion catalog, not the White House. After Union College, Arthur studied law and passed the bar in New York. He built a successful legal career, defending fugitive slaves in several high-profile cases. He believed in civil rights, at least in theory, and used his legal skills to challenge unjust laws. But he was also deeply involved in New York's political machine, working for Senator Roscoe Conkling and securing patronage jobs for party loyalists. Arthur became vice president under James Garfield in 1880, mostly to balance the ticket. He was a political insider, a machine politician, and no one expected him to become president. Then Garfield was assassinated, and suddenly Chester A. Arthur, fashionable, social, machine politician Chester A. Arthur was running the country. And here's the twist. He was surprisingly good at it. He supported civil service reform, breaking with his old political allies and pushing for merit-based government appointments. He modernized the Navy, vetoed a restrictive Chinese immigration bill, and generally acted with more integrity than anyone expected. His old friends felt betrayed. Reformers were shocked. Arthur just kept doing what he thought was right. His education at Union College gave him intellectual tools and social polish, but his real growth happened when he had to choose between loyalty and principle. He chose principle, which cost him his political career but earned him a decent place in history. And speaking of people who looked good but accomplished little, the next guy fits that description perfectly. Grover Cleveland, the self-taught lawyer who married his ward Garfield. Cleveland didn't go to college. He couldn't afford it. He grew up in New York, the son of a Presbyterian minister who died when Cleveland was 16. He worked odd jobs, supported his family, and apprenticed as a law clerk in Buffalo. He read law books, observed trials, and taught himself enough to pass the bar exam in 1859. Cleveland was methodical, disciplined, and brutally honest. He worked long hours, saved money, and built a reputation as a competent attorney. He entered politics, becoming mayor of Buffalo, then governor of New York, and then president in 1885. He won on a platform of reform and honesty, which was refreshing after decades of corruption. His personal life, however, was complicated. He had an affair with a woman named Maria Halpin, and when she became pregnant, he paid child support but denied paternity. The scandal erupted during his presidential campaign. His opponents chanted, "Mama, where's my pa?" Cleveland's supporters responded, "Gone to the White House? Ha ha ha," after he won, which is disturbing on multiple levels but apparently passed for political humor in the 1880s. Cleveland also married Frances Folsom, the daughter of his deceased law partner. He had been her legal guardian after her father died, watching her grow up, and then married her when she was 21 and he was 49. She became the youngest First Lady in history. The whole thing is deeply uncomfortable by modern standards, but it was legal and apparently accepted at the time. Cleveland's education, or lack thereof, didn't stop him from becoming president twice. He was the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, losing in 1888, then winning again in 1892. He was competent, stubborn, and uncompromising, which made him effective but not particularly popular. Sometimes self-education produces discipline and integrity. Other times it just produces stubbornness. Cleveland had both. The next guy, however, went to college and still managed to be forgettable. Benjamin Harrison, the Miami University graduate who lost the popular vote. Benjamin Harrison attended Farmers College in Ohio briefly, then transferred to Miami University, where he graduated in 1852. He studied Latin, Greek, history, and philosophy, and was known for his serious demeanor and Presbyterian faith. He was devout, disciplined, and not particularly fun at parties. After graduating, he studied law, passed the bar, and opened a practice in Indianapolis. Harrison was the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the president who died after a month in office, allegedly from pneumonia caused by giving a long inaugural speech in the rain. Benjamin was determined not to make the same mistake. He gave a much shorter inaugural address and didn't die, so that's progress. Harrison served in the Union Army during the Civil War, rising to the rank of brigadier general. He fought at Peachtree Creek and in Sherman's Atlanta campaign, earning a reputation for competence. After the war, he returned to Indiana, practiced law, and entered politics. He became a senator, then ran for president in 1888. He lost the popular vote to Grover Cleveland, but won the Electoral College, which seems to be a recurring theme in American politics. Harrison's presidency was unremarkable. He signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, supported civil rights legislation that went nowhere, and watched his party lose control of Congress in the midterms. He ran for re-election in 1892 and lost to Cleveland in a rematch. Harrison's education at Miami University gave him knowledge and discipline, but it didn't make him charismatic or politically skilled. He was competent, honest, and boring. which is fine for a lawyer but limiting for a president. The next guy, however, was anything but boring, even though he also didn't finish college. William McKinley, the Allegheny dropout who died for a handshake. William McKinley attended Allegheny College in Pennsylvania for one semester before dropping out due to illness and financial difficulties. He never returned. Instead, he taught school briefly, enlisted in the Union Army when the Civil War began, and spent 4 years fighting. He served under Rutherford B. Hayes, who became his mentor and political patron. After the war, McKinley studied law through apprenticeship, reading legal texts and observing court cases until he passed the bar in 1867. He opened a practice in Ohio, married Ida Saxton, and entered politics. He became a congressman, then governor of Ohio, and then president in 1897. McKinley's presidency is remembered for the Spanish-American War, which lasted about 4 months and resulted in the U.S. acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. He also oversaw a period of economic growth and supported the gold standard, which was wildly popular with bankers and deeply unpopular with farmers. He won re-election easily in 1900. Then, on September 6, 1901, he attended the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. He was shaking hands in a receiving line when Leon Czolgosz, an anarchist, shot him twice in the abdomen. McKinley lingered for 8 days, his doctors trying desperately to save him, but gangrene set in and he died on September 14th. McKinley's lack of formal education didn't hinder his political career. He was affable, strategic, and politically savvy, but no amount of education can protect you from a man with a gun who believes violence is the answer. The man who replaced him, however, had more education than most and enough energy to power a small city. Theodore Roosevelt, the Harvard naturalist who never stopped talking. Theodore Roosevelt attended Harvard College, graduating in 1880 with a Bachelor of Arts. He studied natural history, biology, and literature, and was an enthusiastic, if unconventional, student. He kept live animals in his dorm room, snakes, turtles, mice, and conducted amateur taxidermy experiments. His professors tolerated it because he was brilliant, energetic, and impossible to ignore. After Harvard, Roosevelt briefly attended Columbia Law School, but dropped out because he found it boring. He didn't need a law degree. He had money, connections, and ambition. He entered politics, becoming the youngest member of the New York State Assembly at age 23. He was loud, idealistic, and completely uninterested in playing by the rules. Roosevelt was a naturalist, a historian, and a writer. He published his first book, The Naval War of 1812, while still in his 20s. It became a standard reference text. He wrote dozens more books over his lifetime, covering topics from biology to biography to philosophy. He read voraciously, often finishing a book a day, even while president. He was also physically fearless, some would say recklessly so. He boxed, hiked, hunted, and once gave a campaign speech with a bullet lodged in his chest after being shot by a would-be assassin. The bullet hit his metal glasses case and a folded speech in his pocket, slowing it enough that it didn't kill him. He finished the speech, 90 minutes long, before seeking medical attention. Roosevelt's education at Harvard gave him intellectual breadth, but his real education came from life. He learned politics by doing it, leadership by commanding, and courage by constantly throwing himself into danger. He was exhausting, brilliant, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. The next guy was quieter, calmer, and much, much larger. William Howard Taft, the Yale graduate, who became Chief Justice. William Howard Taft attended Yale College, graduating in 1878 as salutatorian of his class. He was an excellent student, excelling in rhetoric, mathematics, and wrestling. Yes, wrestling. Taft was a heavyweight champion wrestler at Yale, which is difficult to imagine given that he later weighed over 300 pounds. But in college, he was athletic, competitive, and successful. After Yale, Taft attended Cincinnati Law School, earning his law degree in 1880. He passed without the bar, practiced briefly, and then entered public service. He became a judge, solicitor general, a federal appellate judge, and governor general of the Philippines. He was competent, thoughtful, and deeply committed to the law. Taft didn't want to be president. He wanted to be a Supreme Court justice, but his wife, Nellie, and his mentor, Theodore Roosevelt, pushed him into politics. He ran for president in 1908, won, and spent 4 miserable years in the White House. He was a terrible politician, uncomfortable with the press, and alienated Roosevelt, who turned against him and ran as a third-party candidate in 1912, splitting the Republican vote and handing the presidency to Woodrow Wilson. Taft left office relieved. In 1921, President Warren Harding appointed him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, making Taft the only person to serve as both President and Chief Justice. He loved the job. He thrived there, writing important opinions and modernizing the court's procedures. He finally got what he wanted. Taft's education at Yale and Cincinnati gave him the legal knowledge and analytical skills to excel as a judge, but it didn't make him a good president. Sometimes the right education just prepares you for the wrong job. And speaking of people in the wrong job, the next president was an academic who thought he could run the world. Woodrow Wilson. The only president with a PhD, Woodrow Wilson attended Princeton University, then called the College of New Jersey, graduating in 1879. He was an excellent student, fascinated by political science, history, and oratory. After Princeton, he attended the University of Virginia Law School, but withdrew due to poor health before finishing. He practiced law briefly, hated it, and decided to pursue an academic career instead. Wilson enrolled at Johns Hopkins University, where he earned a PhD in political science in 1886. His dissertation, Congressional Government, analyzed the American legislative process and became a foundational text in political science. He was the first and only U.S. president to hold a PhD, which he mentioned approximately never because he wasn't obnoxious about it, just deeply convinced he was smarter than everyone else. After earning his doctorate, Wilson became a professor teaching at Bryn Mawr, Wesleyan, and eventually Princeton, where he became president of the university in 1902. He transformed Princeton, modernizing the curriculum, raising academic standards, and clashing with alumni over elitism. He alienated enough people that he left academia and entered politics, becoming governor of New Jersey in 1911 and president in 1913. Wilson's presidency was transformative and deeply flawed. He established the Federal Reserve, signed antitrust legislation, and led the U.S. through World War I. He proposed the League of Nations, a precursor to the United Nations, and won the Nobel Peace Prize. But he also screened The Birth of a Nation in the White House, a film that glorified the Ku Klux Klan. And he resegregated federal offices, undoing decades of progress for Black Americans. Wilson's education was unparalleled. He was an intellectual, a scholar, and a visionary. But his brilliance didn't make him moral. Education teaches you how to think. It doesn't teach you what to value. And Wilson valued some people far more than others. The next guy had far less education and far fewer ideas, which somehow made him more popular. Warren G. Harding, the Ohio Central graduate. Who loved poker, Warren G. Harding attended Ohio Central College, a small school that no longer exists, graduating in 1882. It wasn't a prestigious institution. It wasn't even particularly rigorous. But Harding earned his degree, studied rhetoric and journalism, and learned enough to become a newspaper editor in Marion, Ohio. Harding also attended Ohio State Normal School briefly, earning a teaching certificate, though he never taught. He preferred journalism, politics, and poker, roughly in that order. He bought a struggling newspaper, turned it into a successful enterprise, and used it as a platform to enter politics. He was handsome, charming, and utterly mediocre. He became a state senator, lieutenant governor, U.S. senator, and then president in 1921. His campaign slogan was "Return to Normalcy," which appealed to a country exhausted by World War I and the progressive reforms of the Wilson administration. Harding promised to do less, and he delivered. His presidency was marked by scandal. His appointees were corrupt, stealing from the government and selling access. The Teapot Dome scandal involved his Secretary of the Interior leasing federal oil reserves in exchange for bribes. Harding wasn't directly implicated, but his judgment was terrible, and his administration was a disaster. He died suddenly in 1923, possibly of a heart attack, possibly of a stroke, possibly of poisoning, depending on which conspiracy theory you prefer. His death was sudden enough that no autopsy was performed, which fueled decades of speculation. Harding's education was minimal, and his intellectual curiosity was non-existent. He liked poker, women, and whiskey in no particular order. He was elected because he looked presidential, not because he was. Sometimes that's all it takes. The next guy was the exact opposite: smart, disciplined, and emotionally unavailable. Calvin Coolidge, the Amherst graduate who said nothing. Calvin Coolidge attended Amherst College in Massachusetts, graduating cum laude in 1895. He studied philosophy, rhetoric, and history, excelling in public speaking despite being painfully shy. He was known for his dry wit and his ability to say very little while sounding profound. After Amherst, he studied law at Northampton Law School and passed the bar in 1897. Coolidge entered politics in Massachusetts, becoming a city councilman, mayor, state legislator, lieutenant governor, and governor. He gained national attention in 1919 when he broke a police strike in Boston, declaring, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." It was a bold statement that made him a conservative hero and led to his selection as vice president under Warren Harding in 1920. When Harding died in 1923, Coolidge became president. He was sworn in by his father, a notary public, at 2:47 a.m. in a Vermont farmhouse lit by kerosene lamps. It's one of the most picturesque presidential inaugurations in history. Coolidge's presidency was defined by inaction. He believed in limited government, low taxes, and letting businesses do whatever they wanted. He vetoed bills, slept 11 hours a day, and said so little that he was nicknamed Silent Cal. When a dinner guest told him she'd bet she could get him to say more than 2 words, he replied, "You lose." His education at Amherst gave him intellectual rigor and rhetorical skill, but his personality was defined by restraint. He said what needed to be said and nothing more, which was either wisdom or laziness, depending on your perspective. The next guy, however, believed in doing everything, all the time, whether it helped or not. Herbert Hoover, the Stanford engineer who tried too hard. Herbert Hoover was part of Stanford University's first graduating class, earning a geology degree in 1895. Stanford was brand new, experimental, and tuition-free. Hoover arrived with almost no money, worked his way through school, and graduated with skills in mining engineering that made him wealthy before he turned 40. After Stanford, Hoover worked as a mining engineer in Australia, China, and around the world. He built mines, managed operations, and became an expert in logistics and efficiency. He was so successful that by the time World War I began, he was already rich and respected. He organized relief efforts in Europe, feeding millions of starving people in Belgium and later across the continent. He was brilliant, tireless, and deeply committed to public service. He became Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge, modernizing the department and promoting business efficiency. He ran for president in 1928 and won in a landslide. He seemed like the perfect candidate, competent, experienced, and successful. Then the stock market crashed in 1929. The Great Depression began, and Hoover's presidency collapsed. He believed in limited government intervention, voluntary cooperation, and the power of American individualism. He tried to fix the economy through encouragement and optimism, but it wasn't enough. Unemployment soared, banks failed, and people starved. Homeless encampments were called Hoovervilles. Hoover became a symbol of failure. His education at Stanford gave him technical skill and problem-solving ability, but it didn't prepare him for a crisis that required bold government action. He was an engineer trying to fix a problem that needed a politician. Sometimes the right education just isn't enough. And with that, we've covered the first 30 presidents. Halfway there. The next 15 get even stranger, but we'll get to them eventually. For now, rest. History isn't going anywhere. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Harvard man who couldn't walk but never stopped moving. Franklin Delano Roosevelt attended Groton School, an elite preparatory academy in Massachusetts, before enrolling at Harvard College. He graduated in 1903 with a Bachelor of Arts in History, though he wasn't a particularly distinguished student. He was more interested in campus politics, social clubs, and the Harvard Crimson newspaper, where he became editor. Roosevelt was charming, well-connected, and already thinking about a political career modeled after his distant cousin, Theodore Roosevelt. After Harvard, FDR attended Columbia Law School in New York City. He studied there for 3 years but never completed his degree. He passed the bar exam in 1907 and simply left, because once you're licensed to practice law, why bother finishing? He worked briefly at a Wall Street firm, found it boring, and shifted to politics almost immediately. Roosevelt's real education came from polio. In 1921, at age 39, he contracted the disease and lost the use of his legs. He spent years trying to recover, undergoing painful treatments, learning to stand with leg braces, and teaching himself to project strength despite being unable to walk unassisted. The press cooperated in hiding his disability, rarely photographing him in his wheelchair. Because America in the 1930s wasn't ready for a president who couldn't stand, but Roosevelt could lead. He became governor of New York in 1929, then president in 1933, just as the Great Depression reached its worst point. He served 4 terms, 12 years, longer than any other president. He created Social Security, the New Deal, and led the country through World War II. He was bold, experimental, and willing to try anything to fix the economy, even if it meant expanding government power in ways that horrified conservatives. His Harvard education gave him social polish and connections, but his disability gave him empathy and resilience. He understood suffering because he'd lived it. He knew how to endure because he'd had no choice. Roosevelt died in office in April 1945, just weeks before Germany surrendered. The man who replaced him had no college degree, no political pedigree, and no idea what he was walking into. Harry S. Truman, the haberdasher who read everything, Harry S. Truman never went to college. He graduated from high school in Independence, Missouri, in 1901 and wanted to attend West Point, but his eyesight was too poor. So he worked. He farmed, worked at a bank, and briefly attended a business college in Kansas City, taking night classes in bookkeeping and typing. He didn't finish. Money was tight, and his family needed him. Truman was self-educated in the truest sense. He read constantly: history, biography, military strategy, philosophy. He claimed to have read every book in the Independence Public Library by the time he was 14, which is almost certainly an exaggeration, but reveals his appetite for learning. He admired ancient leaders like Cincinnatus and Cato, and he studied military campaigns the way other people followed baseball. He served in World War I as an artillery officer, leading Battery D in France and earning respect from his men for his competence under fire. After the war, he opened a haberdashery, a men's clothing store, in Kansas City with a friend. The business failed during the recession of 1921, leaving Truman in debt for years, but he paid back every penny, which became part of his political image: honest, hardworking, and stubborn. Truman entered politics through the Kansas City political machine, becoming a county judge, then a U.S. senator. He was seen as competent but unremarkable. When Franklin Roosevelt chose him as vice president in 1944, many saw it as a safe, boring choice. Truman had been vice president for just 82 days when Roosevelt died, and suddenly he was president. He made some of the biggest decisions in history, dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, establishing the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, recognizing Israel, desegregating the military. He did all this without a college degree, relying on reading, experience, and a willingness to make hard choices. Truman proved that formal education wasn't necessary for leadership. Curiosity, discipline, and moral clarity were enough. But the next guy had plenty of formal education, all of it military. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the West Point general who planned D-Day. Dwight Eisenhower attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, graduating in 1915. His class was called the class the stars fell on because 59 of its 164 members became generals. Eisenhower ranked 61st academically, which sounds mediocre until you realize he was competing against future generals like Omar Bradley. He excelled in football until a knee injury ended his playing career, forcing him to focus on academics and leadership. After West Point, Eisenhower's education continued through military schools. He attended the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, where he graduated first in his class of 275 officers. He studied strategy, logistics, and leadership under some of the Army's best minds. He learned how to plan large-scale operations, manage complex organizations, and make decisions under pressure. Eisenhower never saw combat in World War I, which frustrated him. He spent the war stateside, training tank crews and managing logistics. He was good at it, but he wanted action. Instead, he got bureaucracy. He worked his way up through staff positions, becoming an aide to General Douglas MacArthur and serving in the Philippines. The work was tedious, but it taught him politics, diplomacy, and how to manage egos. When World War II began, Eisenhower's organizational genius became invaluable. He planned Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, and later Supreme Allied Commander of Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Normandy. He coordinated armies from multiple nations, balanced competing egos among Allied leaders, and made life-or-death decisions affecting millions. He wasn't the most brilliant strategist, but he was the best organizer and diplomat. After the war, Eisenhower became president of Columbia University, briefly, though he was a terrible fit for academic life. He was elected president of the United States in 1952 and served 2 terms, overseeing the interstate highway system, the end of the Korean War, and the beginning of the Cold War's space race. Eisenhower's West Point education gave him discipline and technical knowledge, but his real education came from managing people, navigating politics, and learning when to act and when to wait. Sometimes leadership is less about knowing everything and more about knowing who to trust. The next president had all the advantages: wealth, charm, and a Harvard education, but he also had chronic pain, family tragedy, and very little time. John F. Kennedy, the Harvard graduate who almost died several times. John F. Kennedy attended Choate, an elite preparatory school in Connecticut, before enrolling at Princeton University for a brief semester. He withdrew due to illness, jaundice possibly, and later enrolled at Harvard College, graduating in 1940 with a Bachelor of Arts in International Affairs. His senior thesis on British appeasement of Nazi Germany was expanded into a best-selling book, Why England Slept, published when he was just 23. It wasn't a work of genius, but it was competent, timely, and it helped establish Kennedy as a serious thinker. Kennedy briefly attended Stanford Business School after Harvard, but withdrew after a few months. He wasn't interested in business. He was restless, sickly, and searching for purpose. World War II gave him one. He joined the Navy, commanded a patrol torpedo boat known as PT-109, and became a war hero when a Japanese destroyer rammed his boat in the South Pacific. Kennedy swam for hours pulling an injured crewman to safety, injuring his already weak back in the process. The story became legend, though Kennedy later joked that the real question was how he let his boat get hit in the first place. Kennedy's health was terrible. He suffered from chronic back pain, Addison's disease, and a host of other ailments. He took medications constantly, some of them dangerous, just to function. He was in pain most of his life, though he hid it brilliantly. The public saw charisma, youth, and vigor. Behind the scenes was a man who could barely stand without a back brace. His Harvard education gave him intellectual credibility and connections. His family's wealth gave him access. But his real education came from pain, war, and the relentless pressure of living up to his father's expectations. Joseph Kennedy Sr. pushed his sons ruthlessly, grooming them for power. When Joe Jr., the favored son, died in World War II, that pressure shifted to Jack. Kennedy became a congressman, a senator, and then president in 1961 at age 43, the youngest elected president in history. He served less than 3 years before being assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963. His education prepared him for leadership, but nothing could prepare him for that. The man who replaced him had far less polish and far more ambition. Lyndon B. Johnson. The Texas teacher who bullied his way to the top, Lyndon B. Johnson attended Southwest Texas State Teachers College, now Texas State University, graduating in 1930 with a Bachelor of Science degree. He wasn't from wealth or privilege. He grew up in the Texas Hill Country, and college was a struggle. He worked his way through, taking breaks to teach Mexican-American children in Cotulla, Texas, a poor, segregated town where students had almost nothing. Johnson later said that experience shaped his commitment to education and civil rights, though whether that's true or retroactive justification is debatable. After college, Johnson briefly attended Georgetown University Law School in Washington, D.C., but he didn't finish. He wasn't interested in law. He was interested in power. He became a congressional aide, learning how Congress worked from the inside. He absorbed everything: parliamentary procedure, political alliances, who owed favors to whom. He was ambitious, relentless, and shameless. Johnson became a congressman in 1937, a senator in 1949, and Senate Majority Leader in 1955, where he mastered the art of political persuasion. The Johnson treatment was legendary. He would corner colleagues, invade their personal space, cajole, threaten, flatter, and negotiate until they agreed to whatever he wanted. He was exhausting, effective, and completely without shame. He became vice president under Kennedy in 1961, a role he hated. He went from being the most powerful man in the Senate to a ceremonial figurehead. Then Kennedy was assassinated, and Johnson became president. He pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, monumental achievements. He launched the War on Poverty, created Medicare and Medicaid, and expanded federal power in ways that reshaped American society. But he also escalated the Vietnam War, sending hundreds of thousands of troops into a conflict that became a catastrophe. The war destroyed his presidency, and he chose not to run for re-election in 1968. Johnson's education at a teacher's college gave him empathy for the poor and marginalized, or at least a political understanding of their importance. But his real education came from years in Congress, learning how power worked and how to wield it ruthlessly. Sometimes that's enough to change history. Sometimes it's not enough to avoid disaster. The next guy, however, had plenty of education and still became the only president to resign in disgrace. Richard Nixon, the Whittier and Duke graduate, who self-destructed. Richard Nixon attended Whittier College, a small Quaker school in California, graduating in 1934. He was an excellent student, winning debate competitions and earning a scholarship to Duke University Law School, one of the top law programs in the country. Nixon graduated third in his class from Duke in 1937, which should have opened doors at elite law firms. It didn't. He applied to the FBI and top New York firms and was rejected by all of them, a humiliation he never forgot. Nixon returned to California, practiced small-town law, and entered politics after World War II. He served in the Navy during the war, working in logistics in the South Pacific, far from combat. After the war, he ran for Congress as a Republican, won, and built a reputation as a fierce anti-communist. He exposed Alger Hiss, a State Department official accused of espionage, which made Nixon a conservative hero. He became a senator, then vice president under Eisenhower at age 39. He ran for president in 1960, lost narrowly to Kennedy in one of the closest elections in history, then lost a race for California governor in 1962. He held a bitter press conference and told reporters, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." Everyone assumed his career was over, but Nixon came back. He won the presidency in 1968 and again in 1972 in a landslide. His first term had real accomplishments: opening relations with China, negotiating arms control treaties with the Soviet Union, establishing the Environmental Protection Agency. But Nixon was paranoid, insecure, and vindictive. He kept enemies' lists, authorized illegal surveillance, and approved the Watergate break-in, a burglary of Democratic National Committee headquarters. When the cover-up unraveled, Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974, the only president to do so. His education at Whittier and Duke gave him legal knowledge and intellectual tools, but it couldn't save him from his own worst instincts. Sometimes brilliance and insecurity combine into self-destruction. The man who replaced him was decent, honest, and completely accidental. Gerald Ford, the Michigan and Yale graduate. Nobody elected, Gerald Ford attended the University of Michigan, graduating in 1935 with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics. He was an excellent student and a star football player, earning Most Valuable Player honors and helping Michigan win national championships in 1932 and 1933. He was good enough that the Green Bay Packers and Detroit Lions offered him professional contracts, but Ford turned them down to attend Yale Law School. At Yale, Ford worked as an assistant football and boxing coach while earning his law degree, graduating in 1941. It was an impressive achievement, working full-time while attending one of the best law schools in the country. Ford wasn't naturally brilliant, but he was disciplined, hardworking, and reliable. Those qualities defined his entire career. Ford served in the Navy during World War II, earning 10 battle stars aboard the USS Monroe, an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. After the war, he practiced law briefly, then entered politics, winning a congressional seat in Michigan in 1948. He served 25 years in the House of Representatives, becoming House Minority Leader in 1965. In 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned after pleading no contest to tax evasion. Nixon appointed Ford as vice president under the 25th Amendment. Then Nixon resigned and Ford became president. He was the only person to serve as both vice president and president without being elected to either office. Ford's presidency was defined by one decision: pardoning Nixon. Ford believed it was necessary to heal the country, but it was deeply unpopular. He lost the 1976 election to Jimmy Carter, partly because of that pardon. Ford's education at Michigan and Yale gave him legal knowledge and discipline, but his real strength was decency. He was honest, straightforward, and trustworthy, qualities that seem almost quaint in retrospect. Sometimes that's exactly what a country needs: even if it doesn't realize it at the time. The next guy was also decent, deeply religious, and possibly the smartest president in modern history. He also served one term and was considered a failure. Jimmy Carter, the Naval Academy graduate who studied nuclear physics. Jimmy Carter attended the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, graduating in 1946 with a Bachelor of Science degree. He ranked 59th out of 820 midshipmen, which is respectable but not exceptional. Carter was disciplined, serious, and deeply committed to service. After graduation, he served on submarines, eventually working on the Navy's nuclear submarine program under Admiral Hyman Rickover, a brilliant, demanding engineer who terrified everyone who worked for him. Carter studied nuclear physics, reactor technology, and engineering. He was selected for the nuclear program because he was smart, reliable, and willing to endure Rickover's brutal standards. Carter later said Rickover was one of the most influential people in his life, teaching him that good enough was never good enough. Carter's naval career ended abruptly when his father died in 1953. He returned to Georgia to run the family peanut farm, a decision his wife, Rosalind, opposed. Carter turned the farm into a successful business, entered local politics, and eventually became governor of Georgia in 1971. He ran for president in 1976 as a Washington outsider, winning partly because the country was exhausted by Vietnam, Watergate, and political corruption. Carter's presidency was marked by intelligence, integrity, and bad luck. He brokered the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, established the Department of Energy and the Department of Education, and appointed a record number of women and minorities to federal positions. But the economy stagnated, the Iran hostage crisis dragged on for over a year, and Carter's micromanagement style frustrated his staff and Congress. He lost re-election to Ronald Reagan in 1980 in a landslide. But Carter's post-presidency has been extraordinary. He built homes with Habitat for Humanity, negotiated peace agreements, monitored elections, and worked to eradicate diseases. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. Carter's education at the Naval Academy gave him technical knowledge and discipline, but his real legacy is moral consistency. He tried to lead with honesty and principle, even when it cost him politically. Sometimes that's worth more than winning. The next guy, however, cared very much about winning and had almost no interest in policy details. Ronald Reagan, the Eureka College graduate, who changed everything. Ronald Reagan attended Eureka College, a small liberal arts school in Illinois, graduating in 1928 with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Sociology. Eureka wasn't prestigious, but Reagan thrived there. He played football, acted in plays, served as student body president, and developed the charm and communication skills that defined his career. He wasn't an intellectual, he wasn't a policy wonk, but he could connect with people in a way that felt effortless. After college, Reagan worked as a radio sports announcer, moved to Hollywood, and became a movie actor. He appeared in over 50 films, none of them classics, but he was likable, professional, and successful enough to make a living. He served as president of the Screen Actors Guild, navigating labor disputes and the Hollywood blacklist during the anti-communist hysteria of the 1940s and 50s. That experience taught him negotiation, public speaking, and political strategy. Reagan's politics shifted over time. He was a New Deal Democrat in his youth, but by the 1960s, he'd become a conservative Republican. He gave a televised speech for Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign in 1964 that electrified conservatives and launched his political career. He was elected governor of California in 1966 and served 2 terms, learning how to govern, compromise, and build coalitions. Reagan ran for president in 1980 and won, defeating Jimmy Carter in a landslide. His presidency redefined American politics. He cut taxes, increased military spending, confronted the Soviet Union, and communicated conservative ideas with optimism and humor. He survived an assassination attempt in 1981, joking with doctors and projecting strength even as he nearly died. Reagan's education at Eureka was modest, but his real education came from acting, negotiating, and learning how to sell a message. He understood that politics was performance, that rhetoric mattered, and that optimism could be a political weapon. He wasn't the smartest president, but he was one of the most effective communicators. Sometimes that's more important. The next guy was Reagan's vice president, a war hero with impeccable credentials and a tendency to stumble over his words, George H.W. Bush. The Yale graduate who jumped out of planes, George H.W. Bush attended Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, one of the most elite prep schools in America, before enlisting in the Navy on his 18th birthday, the day he graduated. It was 1942, and World War II was raging. Bush became a naval aviator, the youngest in the Navy at the time, flying torpedo bombers in the Pacific. On September 2nd, 1944, Bush's plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire during a bombing raid on the Japanese-held island of Chichijima. The plane was on fire. Bush completed his bomb run, then ordered his crew to bail out. He parachuted into the ocean and was rescued by a submarine. His 2 crewmen died. Bush carried guilt over their deaths for the rest of his life. After the war, Bush attended Yale University, graduating in 1948 with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics. He finished in just 2.5 years, accelerated by wartime schedules. At Yale, he was captain of the baseball team, a member of the Skull and Bones Secret Society, and popular with classmates. He wasn't the best student, but he was well-liked and well-connected. Bush moved to Texas, worked in the oil industry, made a fortune, and entered politics. He served in Congress, as ambassador to the United Nations, as director of the CIA, and as vice president under Reagan before winning the presidency in 1988. His presidency included the end of the Cold War, the first Gulf War, and the beginning of an economic recession that cost him re-election in 1992. Bush's education at Andover and Yale gave him social capital and connections, but his real education came from war, business, and decades of public service. He was experienced, competent, and decent, but he struggled to communicate vision and connect emotionally with voters. Sometimes competence isn't enough. The next guy, however, had no trouble connecting with voters. He was brilliant, charming, and undisciplined in equal measure. Bill Clinton, the Rhodes Scholar who couldn't say no. Bill Clinton attended Georgetown University, graduating in 1968 with a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service. He was ambitious, hardworking, and obsessed with politics from a young age. At Georgetown, he worked as an intern for Senator J. William Fulbright, absorbing lessons in foreign policy and political strategy. He was also class president, a sign of his early talent for campaigning. Clinton wasn't just interested in politics, he was consumed by it. He collected handshakes, phone numbers, and connections the way other students collected textbooks. After Georgetown, Clinton won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University, one of the most prestigious academic honors in the world. The Rhodes takes the best and brightest American students and sends them to England to study, network, and presumably learn to appreciate tea. Clinton studied politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford, but didn't complete a degree. He spent 2 years there, protested the Vietnam War, traveled through Europe, and avoided the draft through a combination of luck, timing, and a controversial letter explaining his opposition to the war. That letter would haunt him decades later during his presidential campaigns, but at the time it kept him out of Vietnam. Clinton then attended Yale Law School, earning his Juris Doctor in 1973. At Yale, he met Hillary Rodham, a fellow law student who would become his wife and political partner. Their relationship was intense, intellectual, and complicated from the start. Clinton was smart, charming, and scattered, the kind of student who procrastinated and then pulled all-nighters to finish brilliant work at the last minute. He could talk his way through anything, which is a useful skill in law school and an essential one in politics. After law school, Clinton returned to Arkansas, taught law briefly at the University of Arkansas, and entered politics almost immediately. He ran for Congress in 1974 and lost, but he learned from the experience. He became Arkansas Attorney General in 1977, then governor in 1979 at age 32, making him one of the youngest governors in the country. He lost re-election in 1980, a humiliating defeat that taught him valuable lessons about political vulnerability, then won again in 1982 and served multiple terms. He was a master of retail politics, remembering names, asking about people's families, and making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. Clinton ran for president in 1992, winning on a platform of economic reform and generational change. He positioned himself as a new Democrat, centrist and pragmatic, willing to challenge party orthodoxy. He defeated incumbent President George H.W. Bush, partly because of the economy and partly because Ross Perot split the vote. Clinton's presidency was marked by economic growth, welfare reform, a federal budget surplus, and the impeachment trial over his affair with Monica Lewinsky, a White House intern. The Lewinsky scandal consumed his second term. Clinton lied under oath about the affair, was impeached by the House of Representatives, and was acquitted by the Senate. He survived politically but damaged his legacy permanently. Clinton's education at Georgetown, Oxford, and Yale gave him intellectual breadth and credibility, but his real talent was political instinct. He could read a room, connect with voters, and explain complex policies in simple terms. He felt people's pain. Literally, he said that phrase during the 1992 campaign, and voters believed him. His flaw was self-control. He was brilliant, disciplined in some ways, and completely undisciplined in others. Sometimes intelligence isn't enough if you can't control your impulses. The next guy had an Ivy League pedigree, a famous last name, and a folksy persona that made people underestimate him constantly. George W. Bush, the Yale and Harvard graduate who played dumb. Bush attended Yale University, just like his father and grandfather before him. He graduated in 1968 with a Bachelor of Arts in History. Bush wasn't a distinguished student. He was a C student, a member of Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity, president of that fraternity actually, and a cheerleader. Yes, cheerleader. He was social, charming, and not particularly interested in academics. Yale was a family tradition, an expected stop on the road to success, not a place for intellectual exploration. Bush's time at Yale coincided with the Vietnam War protests, the civil rights movement, and massive social upheaval. But Bush wasn't particularly political. He was more interested in parties, friendships, and having a good time. He later admitted he wasn't a serious student and coasted through on charm and family connections, which is fine if you are planning to go into business, less fine if you're eventually going to run the country. After Yale, Bush served in the Texas Air National Guard during the Vietnam War, flying F-102 fighter jets. His service was controversial because some believed he received preferential treatment due to his family connections, and his attendance records were incomplete. Bush said he fulfilled his obligations. Critics disagreed. The truth is murky and remains disputed. What's clear is that he didn't serve in Vietnam, unlike many of his Yale classmates who weren't lucky enough to have powerful fathers. In 1973, Bush enrolled at Harvard Business School, earning a Master of Business Administration in 1975. He's the only president with an MBA, which sounds impressive until you remember that an MBA teaches you how to maximize shareholder value, not necessarily how to govern. Harvard gave him business knowledge and credibility, But Bush wasn't interested in finance or corporate life. He didn't want to work on Wall Street or climb the corporate ladder. Bush returned to Texas, worked in the oil industry with limited success, tried his hand at various business ventures that mostly failed, and eventually became managing partner of the Texas Rangers baseball team in 1989. That job gave him visibility, credibility, and a public platform. It also made him wealthy when the team was sold in 1998. Bush entered politics in the mid-90s, winning the governorship of Texas in 1994. He was underestimated constantly. People assumed he was writing his father's name, that he wasn't smart or serious. Political opponents made fun of his malapropisms, his casual speaking style, and his apparent lack of intellectual curiosity. But Bush was politically savvy. He worked with Democrats in the Texas legislature, built coalitions, and governed effectively. He won re-election in 1998 by a huge margin. He ran for president in 2000, lost the popular vote to Al Gore by over 500,000 votes, and won the presidency after the Supreme Court stopped the Florida recount in a 5-4 decision. The election was one of the most controversial in American history. Bush became president under a cloud of legitimacy questions that never fully disappeared. His presidency was defined by September 11th, 2001, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the financial crisis of 2008. The September 11th attacks happened less than 8 months into his presidency and completely reshaped his administration. Bush launched the War on Terror, invaded Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban, and then invaded Iraq in 2003 based on claims about weapons of mass destruction that turned out to be false. Bush's education at Yale and Harvard gave him credentials and connections, but his real skill was political instinct and likability. He played up his folksy Texas persona, the ranch, the cowboy boots, the strategery, but he was smarter than people thought. Whether that intelligence was used wisely is another question entirely. His presidency remains deeply divisive. The next president, however, was brilliant by any measure. The first black president, and a constitutional law professor who actually read the Constitution, Barack Obama, the Columbia and Harvard graduate, who made history. Barack Obama attended an Occidental College in Los Angeles for 2 years before transferring to Columbia University in New York, where he graduated in 1983 with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. Obama was serious, introspective, and searching for purpose. He was the son of a Kenyan father and a white mother from Kansas, raised in Hawaii and Indonesia, and trying to figure out where he fit in America's racial landscape. At Columbia, he studied international relations, wrote his senior thesis on nuclear disarmament, and spent much of his time reading and thinking about identity, justice, and his place in the world. Obama's years at Columbia were solitary. He lived off campus, didn't join clubs, and kept to himself. He read voraciously James Baldwin, Malcolm X, W.E.B. Du Bois, trying to understand Black identity, American history, and his own mixed-race experience. He was figuring out who he was, which is what your early 20s are supposed to be for. But Obama took it more seriously than most. After Columbia, Obama worked as a community organizer in Chicago, helping low-income residents fight for better housing and services. It was unglamorous, frustrating work. He organized meetings, knocked on doors, and tried to get people to care about issues that affected their lives. Progress was slow, victories were small, and the work was exhausting. But it shaped his understanding of poverty, power, and grassroots organizing. He later said those years taught him more about leadership than anything else. He learned to listen, to build trust, and to organize people around common goals. In 1988, Obama enrolled at Harvard Law School, where he excelled. He was elected president of the Harvard Law Review in 1990, the first Black person to hold that position in the journal's 103-year history. The election brought national attention. The New York Times wrote a profile. Publishers contacted him about writing a book. Obama graduated magna cum laude in 1991 with a Juris Doctor degree, which meant he finished in the top 10% of his class at one of the best law schools in the world. After law school, Obama returned to Chicago, practiced civil rights law, taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago for 12 years, and entered politics. He became a state senator in 1997, then ran for U.S. Senate in 2004. He gave the keynote speech at the Democratic National Convention that year, a 17-minute address that electrified the audience and made him a national figure overnight. He won his Senate race by a landslide. Obama ran for president in 2008. He defeated Hillary Clinton in a bitter Democratic primary and John McCain in the general election, becoming the first African-American president in U.S. history. His election was historic, emotional, and filled with hope that often proved difficult to fulfill. Obama's presidency included the Affordable Care Act, which extended health insurance to millions of Americans, the recovery from the 2008 financial crisis, the killing of Osama bin Laden, the legalization of same-sex marriage, and the Paris Climate Agreement. He was eloquent, thoughtful, and cautious, which frustrated both supporters who wanted bolder action and critics who saw weakness. His presidency was marked by Republican obstruction, racial tensions, and the rise of the Tea Party movement. Obama's education at Columbia and Harvard gave him intellectual rigor and analytical skill, but his real education came from community organizing and teaching. He learned how to listen, how to build coalitions, and how to communicate complex ideas clearly. Sometimes that combination is enough to change history. Sometimes it's not enough to overcome political gridlock. The next guy, however, had no political experience, no policy expertise, and a reality TV show that made him famous for firing people. Donald Trump, the Wharton graduate who broke every rule. Donald Trump attended Fordham University in the Bronx for 2 years before transferring to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, where he graduated in 1968 with a Bachelor of Science in Economics. Wharton is one of the top business schools in the world, and Trump frequently mentions his degree there, claiming it proves his intelligence and business acumen. He's called himself a really smart person and pointed to his Wharton credentials as evidence. Whether his classmates would agree is unclear. Trump's academic record at Wharton is unknown. The school doesn't release transcripts without permission, and Trump hasn't released his. Former classmates have said he wasn't particularly distinguished, though some remember him as confident and ambitious. One classmate said Trump was not the brightest student, but was skilled at self-promotion even then. Trump disputes this. He disputes most things. After graduating, Trump joined his father's real estate business in New York. Fred Trump had built a successful company developing middle-class apartments in Brooklyn and Queens. Donald wanted more. He wanted Manhattan. He wanted skyscrapers, casinos, and his name in gold letters. He took over the company, renamed it the Trump Organization, and expanded aggressively. He built Trump Tower, bought hotels and casinos in Atlantic City, licensed his name to buildings around the world, and became famous for his wealth, his marriages, and his willingness to talk to any reporter who would listen. Trump's business career was mixed. He made money, lost money, declared bankruptcy multiple times, 6 times actually, using corporate bankruptcies to shed debt while protecting personal assets, and reinvented himself repeatedly. He became a celebrity, a brand, and eventually the host of The Apprentice, a reality TV show where he fired contestants dramatically and taught America his catchphrase, "You're fired." Trump had no political experience before running for president in 2016. He'd flirted with presidential runs before, in 2000 and 2012, but he'd never held elected office or worked in government. He ran as a political outsider, promising to drain the swamp, renegotiate trade deals, and build a wall on the southern border paid for by Mexico. His campaign was unconventional, combative, and filled with controversial statements about immigrants, women, and political opponents. He won the Republican nomination, defeating 16 other candidates through sheer force of personality and media dominance. Then he defeated Hillary Clinton in the general election despite losing the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes. He won the Electoral College by flipping Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, states that hadn't voted Republican in decades. Trump's presidency was chaotic, norm-breaking, and deeply polarizing. He passed tax cuts, appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, renegotiated trade agreements, and governed largely through Twitter. He attacked the media, fired officials who disagreed with him, and rejected traditional presidential decorum. He was impeached twice, first in 2019 for pressuring Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden, second in 2021 for inciting the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. He was acquitted both times by the Senate. Trump's Wharton education gave him business knowledge, but his real education came from decades in real estate, branding, and media. He understood attention, spectacle, and how to dominate news cycles. He knew that controversy generated coverage, that coverage generated attention, and that attention generated power. Whether that made him effective or dangerous depends entirely on your perspective. History will judge, eventually. The current president, however, is about as far from Trump as you can get. Experienced, empathetic, and occasionally forgetful in ways that make voters nervous. Joe Biden, the Delaware and Syracuse graduate who waited his turn. Joe Biden attended the University of Delaware, graduating in 1965 with a Bachelor of Arts in History and Political Science. He was an average student, more interested in sports and social life than academics. Biden played football, hung out with friends, and wasn't particularly focused on his studies. He was popular, well-liked, and not particularly ambitious in the academic sense. College was a place to grow up, not a place to become a scholar. After Delaware, Biden attended Syracuse University College of Law, earning his Juris Doctor in 1968. He ranked 76th out of 85 students, which is diplomatically described as the lower end of his class. Biden wasn't a natural student. He struggled with law school, found it difficult, and graduated near the bottom, which is fine. Not everyone can be first in their class, but it does limit your career options in law. Biden also faced an academic controversy at Syracuse. He was accused of plagiarism for using 5 pages from a law review article without proper citation in a legal brief. Biden claimed it was an unintentional mistake due to his unfamiliarity with citation rules, and the school accepted his explanation. He was required to retake the course and allowed to continue. The incident didn't end his education, but it followed him throughout his political career, resurfacing during his presidential campaigns. After law school, Biden practiced law briefly, then entered politics almost immediately. He was elected to the Newcastle County Council in Delaware in 1970, then ran for U.S. Senate in 1972 at age 29. He was a long shot. His opponent was a popular incumbent Republican in a Republican-leaning state. But Biden campaigned tirelessly, and he won, becoming one of the youngest senators in American history. Weeks after the election, before Biden was even sworn in, his wife Nelia and their infant daughter Naomi were killed in a car accident. His 2 young sons, Beau and Hunter, were seriously injured. Biden was devastated. He considered resigning before ever taking office, but Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield convinced him to serve, and Biden was sworn into the Senate at his son's hospital bedsides in January 1973. Biden commuted from Delaware to Washington by train every day for the next 36 years, so he could be home with his sons every night. It became part of his identity. Amtrak Joe, the senator who rode the train, who prioritized family, who understood loss and grief. Biden served in the Senate for 36 years, becoming one of the most experienced legislators in Congress. He chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He ran for president in 1988, but his campaign collapsed after another plagiarism scandal, this time involving speeches borrowed from British politician Neil Kinnock without attribution. Biden dropped out, humiliated, and returned to the Senate. He ran again in 2008, didn't gain traction, and became Barack Obama's vice president. He served 2 terms, from 2009 to 2017, becoming a trusted advisor and close friend to Obama. He considered running for president in 2016, but decided not to after his son Beau died of brain cancer in 2015. Biden ran for president in 2020 at age 77, positioning himself as a steady, experienced leader who could restore normalcy after the Trump presidency. He won, defeating Trump in both the popular vote and the Electoral College, though Trump refused to concede and falsely claimed the election was stolen. Biden's education at Delaware and Syracuse was unremarkable, but his real education came from decades in the Senate, personal tragedy, and political resilience. He learned how to legislate, compromise, and endure loss. Sometimes experience matters more than credentials. Sometimes surviving is the qualification. And with that, we've reached the end. 45 presidents, 45 educations. Some went to Harvard, some never went anywhere. Some spoke 9 languages, some could barely write. But they all led, for better or worse. Now get some sleep. History will still be here tomorrow. And that brings us to the present. 45 presidents, 45 different paths to power. Some climbed through Ivy League halls. Others taught themselves by candlelight in frontier cabins. Some spoke 9 languages. Others struggled with one. Some were the smartest people in any room they entered. Others just knew how to work a room better than anyone else. Education mattered for some of them. For others, it was almost irrelevant. What mattered more was timing, luck, charisma, resilience, or just being in the right place when history needed someone, anyone, to step up. So, the next time someone tells you that you need the right degree from the right school to accomplish something extraordinary, remember, George Washington never went to college. Abraham Lincoln had less than a year of formal schooling, and Harry Truman read his way to the presidency through a public library in Missouri. And also remember that Zachary Taylor might have died from eating too many cherries. Sleep tight. History will still be weird tomorrow.